In this video tutorial, we're going to walk through all of the available settings and configurations in the Static Mesh Editor window. Whether you are a seasoned UE4 developer or just starting out, hopefully you'll walk away with some new knowledge of the editor. So let's get started. I'm going to go ahead and open up one of these static meshes that I've imported. Now, prior to, I've done just a little bit of setup, which is just assigning the materials to it and adding a couple LODs via the LOD pre-selection. Beyond that, everything is stock. So to start with, let's kind of walk through the main menu system. Now, I'm kind of clumping all three of these together. So this, the viewport tools, the toolbar itself, and then of course the drop-down menu. So to start, let's actually go from the bottom up. Now with this little drop-down, you've got the ability to toggle on and off real time. So if we do that, you'll notice if I pan here, the materials don't update, it's paused. Now granted, if I do move the viewport, you'll notice that they do update in real time, but as soon as I stop panning around, they're stopped. So that's what real time does. Show FPS, show stats, you can do those. Those are the same stats that you'll get in the main editor window. And then of course, field of view, far plane view, and screen percentage. This will actually change the camera that's in the viewport. So helpful at sometimes, most of the time you'll leave this at default. The perspective dropdown, this is a way for you to change your camera. So if you wanted to go to an orthographic view, or you can go to say like right view, we'll just go back to perspective, but those are just a way to change the actual viewport camera to see what you're dealing with. Now that actually comes in handy if you're trying to create custom collision. That way you can line it up perfectly as opposed to trying to work in perspective. And of course this is very similar to the other viewport settings in the main editor where you can switch to say unlit, wireframe, detailed lighting, so on and so forth. So just different visualization buffers to be able to see what's happening with your actual mesh. And then show, these are other things that are tied to the main bar itself, but show pivots, show vertices, bound, simple collision, complex collision, all these. We're not going to walk through all those because we'll toggle them on the main bar. And then finally, the last thing is your LODs. Now, as I said before too, I did set up some LODs ahead of time, so we do have these LODs here that we can switch through, and by selecting this drop down you can choose the exact LOD that you want. So if we left it on auto right now and we zoom the camera back, it's going to switch. Now we can see that up here. It's slightly visible. We've got LOD 3 right now, so I'll zoom in a little bit more. We've now switched to LOD 1, zoom out a little bit, LOD 2. So this is just a way, if you don't want to zoom the camera back and forth to see your LODs, you can simply select this and say we can select LOD 3. And now we are fixed at LOD 3. So I'll switch this back to LOD Auto. And that kind of concludes this little drop down. Now for the main toolbar, save, browse where the asset is in the content browser. Those are pretty obvious. Real time, same one that we have associated here with the drop down. So we can turn off real time. We can turn it back on. Sockets, if we have any sockets. Now this one in particular does not. You can toggle those on and off. Wireframe, on and off. Vert colors. Now vert colors are for the actual mesh. Now there's two ways to use your vertex colors for assets that are in your scene. So for example, if we dropped 100 of these and we painted one of those, that would have its own vertice colors. Now this one is on import. So say for example, I'm working in Maya or Max and I decide to paint some different color vertices. This will show me what those colors are. So I'll turn that off for now. Of course, the grid down below. Bounds. Now this is when you import, this is setting the general bounds of the object. Now you can go in, you can tweak these. Most of the time you may not. Your level designer may go in and do those as well. But that's just simply setting the extents of the actual mesh. Collision. Now if we click this, there's two types. Simple collision, which I'll click on for now, and complex collision. Now, complex collision usually uses the actual geometry of the mesh. You have to be careful with complex collision because you have a lot of vertices to calculate on the back end, which can bog it down. But typically, you may use a simple collision, which may be a little difficult to see, but it's kind of the flashing green extent here. So if we have simple collision on, for example, I can go up to here in collision, which we'll go to, and I'll remove collision. I'm just going to add a simple box. So there you go. So that's showing me my collision now. So that's what the player will collide in. So we'll go ahead and just turn that off. Pivots, normals, binormals, tangents, vertices, all those are kind of pretty self-explanatory. I won't go into detail about what each of those are, but simply toggling those on and off will show you in the viewport where those settings are at. UVs. Now, I won't go too in depth on what the different UVs are. Actually, there's another video that we cover about going more in depth into UVs and light maps. But the basic thing to know is when you import an asset by default, you're usually going to generate two different UV maps. Now, one of those is generated through the editor. The other is generated by you in your content creation. Again, Max, Maya, Blender, whatever you use. And UV channel 0 it's going to be those UVs that you have created, and then UV channel 1 will be the auto-generated light map UVs that Unreal does. So you can toggle those on and off and see what you're doing. Reset camera, just reset your position. Additional data will toggle different things on it, if you've got it. And then finally, the last thing is baked out materials. Now, I don't want to go too deep into baked out materials. There's some great documentation on this one. But when you create your LOD chains, there is a way that you can bake those materials down. So, say for example, I will switch here real fast. It's like LOD2. Okay, in LOD2, I have two materials still being used, right? So I'm using additional draw calls to take each of those materials. With baked out materials, you can bake those down into a single material, lower draw calls, better performance. So that's a nice feature that's integrated into the engine as well. And then finally, we'll go through the main top bar. So under File, pretty self-explanatory, save as, open assets, so on and so forth. Under your Edit, same thing. These are kind of tied to the same main editor stuff. So editor preferences, projects, plugins, same thing. Asset. There's a couple things I want to go through on this one, which is size map and audit assets. So if I click size map, this is a great tool, and I would highly recommend this as an artist, especially, that every so often you open this up. So what is it? It's basically an analysis of your asset as you've imported. Now in this case, what we have selected right now is disk size. So this shows me everything that's associated with this material, how much physical memory is it taking up in storage. So you can see here we've got the actual material instance of our painted 08, which is this first one, our flat metal 06, our LED green, our LED blue, and then the actual static mesh itself. So this is showing me that this particular mesh is taking up maybe 64 megs when you combine everything together. Now again, that's all the materials, all the textures associated with the materials, the actual mesh itself, which is down here, which is very, very small. I mean, that's extremely lightweight. I think it's 35 bytes. So this is a great way just to see, how heavy is this asset? How much of an impact is it going to have on production and performance? And then we can switch this as well to memory size. So this is what's actually taking up your physical memory and your GPU memory. So you can see here, flat metal 06, this is all of our textures, the material, a base color texture 2D. Same thing here with our painted 08. There's the texture 2D, base color, or occlusion roughness map, so on and so forth. So again, this is great as an artist for you to know, how performant is your asset? Is it heavy? Is it lightweight? So this is a great way to do it. And again, that's found up in the asset and size map. And then finally, audit assets, which is another great one to use as well. It's kind of just a summary, a table summary of what this is. So we can see our actual mesh, see size on disk size, and total usage. That's just because we have the one open. How many triangles, vertices, UV channels, materials, the approximate size. Now, approximate size is its space in Unreal units. So if you were to put a bounding box around this is how big it would be. Collision, LODs, so on and so forth. With collision complexity, we're using simple as opposed to using complex as simple. And then if it's assigned with an LOD group, which I had set up earlier under large prop. So just a great way to see what your asset from a high level, where it's at. Okay, and then of course re-import. So if you make changes outside of the editor and you want to re-import your asset, this is a great way to do it. Just click here, re-import, and it will come in. Mesh, we won't worry about that. Collision, I know that I had done a quick example early on, but this is a way that you can add, so let's say for example, I'm going to turn collision back on, show simple collision. I'm going to delete this. Let's say that when I imported this asset from the start, I chose not to auto-generate collision because I wanted to add it post. And here I can go through and I can add whatever kind of collision. So if I do add simplified box collision, right? Or I can do add capsule collision. The cool part about the editor in this one is that you can select those. Now, it may be a little difficult to see, but if I'm able to grab this, I'll go ahead and delete that. I'll grab this guy since that was already selected. You can see it changes colors, right? So it goes from dark to light green. I now have that selected, and I have the same manipulator controls as I do in the editor, so I can scale that down. I can rotate it, right? I can do all different kinds of things to tweak this collision, which will update the actual asset. So any collision that you had here, anytime you drop that in the editor, that is the new collision. So I won't go through all these. There's, again, some great documentation on this. You know, what is 10 DOP versus 18 DOP versus 26. There's a lot of good information out there, as well as some on the auto-convex collision. But this is how you add collision in the engine as opposed to your DCC. And then finally, we've got window. It just will toggle the different panels on and off. And then, of course, help if you need to go with that as well. So that covers kind of the main toolbar, the main drop down. Now, all of these, I kind of skipped over what's in the upper right. These are the exact same controls that you have in the editor, which should be pretty familiar with. Switching between world space, local space, your different translation, rotation, and scaling. Grid snapping, turn it on or off, be able to select the size, rotation, the scale size, and of course your camera speed. All of those are the exact same that you find in the main editor. So that covers the main menu, and now what we'll move on to is the material slots. So with our material slots, these are set up in your DCC. So again, Maya, Max, whatever you want to use. When you assign the different materials to it, that's where it imports these different ones. So in this case, I have, let me turn my collision off. I have 4 different materials. So let's kind of just step through these. So there's a couple things that are really handy here. This highlight and isolate. When you highlight, it shows the assets in orange that you have selected. So if I go to the little blue LEDs and highlight those, which can maybe hard to see because we do have an emissive on there, that will show it in orange. Now if I go to isolate, that will just show those particular points. So this is great. I've used this many times when by accident, say you forget to assign a material to a particular piece and you've got this one random one. This is a great way to just isolate that component and see, oh, okay, that's where it's at. So highlight and isolate. And of course here, same things, you can select different materials, reassign them, or you can select them. So if we went into, I think I've got some materials here. We'll see, yeah. So if I was able to select, I can select this material in the content browser, and then I can select just assign here, and of course it will reassign it, and then we can name it as necessary. So we'll just undo that real fast. So that covers the material slots. And I guess I should say we'll do this as well. So this allows you can select the drop down, so select the material, or select it in your content browser. Use the arrow to assign the selected asset from the content browser. You can use the magnifying glass to navigate to where that material is. So if you're unsure of, you know, hey, I've got this flat metal, I don't know where it's at, click this, it'll automatically move. Your content browser will actually move right to where that's at. And then the little yellow is just resetting to default, and of course you can rename your slots. Now slot names come in handy, especially if you've got dynamic materials or you're using some custom blueprints to target those. That's where that slot name is going to come in handy. So that covers material slots. So let's move on now to LOD settings. For our LOD settings, I've actually I've unrolled the 3 particular settings that you'll want to use, which is the LOD picker, your LOD that you have selected, and your LOD settings. Now we're going to work from the bottom up, as I find that's a little bit easier to understand what's happening. So like I said before, when I imported this asset, prior to kind of just running through this, I set up and just used this preset large prop for my LOD settings. I've mentioned this before, but all of these are controllable in a, I believe it's an XML file that is in the editor that you can set up your own custom LODs. Now each of these has different settings. So if I just expand these out real quick, and in fact, we'll maximize this a little bit better. So in my LOD settings, there's all different kinds of things where you can recompute normals, tangents, you can generate full map or full precision UVs, your minimum light resolution. When you go to reduce, so based off of the previous LODs, you know, are you wanting to reduce by a certain number of triangles, a percentage, your max deviation, all of these various different settings you can target those with your LODs and create your own group. So, you know, say in a production setting, you know, you've got a bunch of rock assets, and you find that the, you know, maybe preset of Vista, maybe those LODs switch out too soon. Maybe you want to add or remove an extra LOD, or maybe you want to have different percentages of triangles. So instead of going 50% each time, maybe it's 85% and then 70%, then 60. You can set all those up in that custom XML and have those assigned as this LOD group. Regardless, though, when you select any of these, it's just those set of rules. So with large prop, it automatically generates 4 LODs and a number of percentages of reduction, so on and so forth. So that's all that I've done here, is just selected this large prop. Now in here, I can do minimum number of LODs. I can do a maximum number of LODs. So if I want to generate, let's say 6, I can bump this up, hit apply changes. I'm going to do this right now, and now you can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. LOD 0 being your base, and of course 5 being the top. So now we've just generated an additional LOD. And then we can check auto compute LOD distances. This one will come in handy, especially if you find when you're kind of trying to troubleshoot your scene and why things are switching out soon. When this is checked, the engine will automatically determine when it should switch LODs based on screen size, which is under this sections under your actual LOD. So each one has, so if I switch here to, like, say LOD 1, you can see it will switch out when the screen size is 0.6, go to LOD 2 when it's 0.5, so on and so forth. So going back to kind of my base auto LODs, if this is checked, you'll notice we don't have the ability to select the screen size. So we'll just keep that unchecked for right now. And then finally, like I said, any changes that you make in here, you just have to click apply changes. It will quickly run through it, and now your LODs are set up. So again, working from our way from the bottom to the top, that is our LOD settings. So I'm going to roll these up because this is probably how you might see it. So if we go to our LOD 0 right now, which is just what's selected because we're on auto, it's the base, we're up close. So let's go through sections first. And sections are going to be everything that's associated with that. To show you an example, I'm going to go ahead and select one of our lowest ones. Well, it kept all of them. But basically, through each of your LODs, you may have different materials or different meshes that show or don't show. These are going to be all of those materials assigned to it. You may find at times when the LODs auto-generate, especially in this case with this example where we have, you know, a flat metal and then an emissive, it's 2 very high contrast materials side by side, that when that LOD auto-generates, it may decide to switch those materials. So my main cabinet here that is a flat painted black material may accidentally get switched with my blue material. That's simply all you have to do is just go in here, select it, and just switch those. So that's all it is. It's just showing you what's associated with those LODs. And then finally, we'll go through the build and reduction settings. So with the build settings, this occurs when the actual LOD is being built. So I'm going to do our first LOD so we can see here. Okay, actually, let's jump back to LOD 0. Everything is going to be based off of your primary LOD 0. So this is when it comes in. Everything that you can see here, build scale, distance field, generations, all those settings. I won't go into too much detail about these. Again, there's some great documentation on this if you really need to know more in depth. But all of these can be checked on, checked off, or readjusted. So when that base, when you import your mesh, that's what's going to take effect. And then we'll jump down to reduction settings, which again, this is what's going to affect based off of the previous LOD. So if I jump to, say, LOD 1, so this is going to be my first LOD from my static mesh. Okay. Now, the rules that have been set with this large prop, I've got percentage triangles, max deviations, silhouette, texture shading, so on and so forth. So with this particular one, to explain what this means, is that for my first LOD, I want it to be at least 50% of the triangle count as my base one. So if we jump here, go back to LOD 0, we can see on import, we have 1,400 or so triangles to start with for our LOD. And based on our LOD 1 switching to 50%, it got it really close, about 736 triangles. So that's our percentage triangles, what it's reducing. Now again, that's based off of the previous. So if we go to LOD 2, we can see our reduction settings is 25%. 25% of the previous at 50%? No, 25% of our base LOD. So that may trip you up, because if you end up going in here and say, you set your LOD 1 at 50% and then LOD 2 at 50%, thinking that you're reducing off of the previously built one. That's not how it's going to work. It's actually going to work off of your base. So that's what that's set up. And then, of course, silhouette, texture, and shading, lowest, low, high, normal, highest. That is simply just saying how much priority you want to take to that. So, for example, with, if we find that the silhouette really breaks down as you get further, you can bump that up to highest. So that's the highest priority. Make sure that you keep that silhouette as close to possible as the base. And then finally, just this hard angle edge. For those of you that are Max users, that would just be your shading groups. For those in Maya, that's your soft or hard edges. That's just simply saying at what angle should I go ahead and harden those edges or soften them. That's going to help reduce maybe some lighting artifacts. Again, if you've got a cube and it gets reduced down and it smooths it, it may look kind of funny. And the final last thing is the ability to remove the LOD. So that kind of takes you through each of the individual LOD settings. And the last one is just your LOD picker, again, which associates to what's up here. So if I switch to 3, you can see it's here on 3, or I can go back to auto. It's now at auto. That's just simply a way for you to be able to select the different LODs that you want to be able to adjust. And of course, custom allows you to select multiples at one time to be able to change things simultaneously. So that's the LOD settings. So now let's go ahead and just move on to our general settings tab. Now that we're under our general settings tab, I do want to make a note that the engine is notorious for this, of having these little roll-ups here. Very, very inconspicuous, but I would say that if you don't normally, I would just expand most of those, because there's some settings in here that are super helpful. Now, in this case, they're nothing that's super beneficial beyond the slight map coordinate index, which we'll talk about. But just make note that if you see a little caret, sometimes it helps to expand it out. So general settings, light map resolution. This is your base light map resolution. Now, a lot of times you'll go back when you're kind of profiling the environment and seeing, hey, do I have enough light map resolution? A lot of times you'll set that in editor. However, let's say that we've got 100 of these things in editor. We don't want to set it in the editor, but we want to actually set it on the mesh itself. This is a way to set kind of that base light map resolution to bump it up. So that's helpful. Generate mesh distance fields. This comes in for your mesh distance field ambient occlusion, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. That's one that, say for example that this is a big mesh that we want to include in that shadow generation. You'd want to check that. LOD for collision. This is a cool one. It works in some situations and sometimes it doesn't. If we jump back a little bit and we had this like simple collision or complex collision, this is probably a bad example to use for LOD for collision because it's a box. It's very, very simple. But let's say that you had a very interesting organic form like a rock formation, and you didn't want to have to go in there and set collision on each and every individual rock to make it work. But let's say that your third or fourth LOD, which is optimized with your triangle count, so it'd make a great collision mesh. This is a way for you to be able to use that. So you can target an actual LOD to use as your collision. So super helpful, especially in organic forms and larger things like rocks and that kind of stuff as well. LPV bias, this is just a multiplier for the light propagation. Leave it at 1 for the most part. That's kind of more an advanced topic. And finally, last thing is this light map coordinate index. So if we jump back to where we had our UV channel 0 and our UV channel 1, UV channel 1 was auto-generated by the engine on import for our light map index. But let's say that, for example, we created 2 UV sets for our asset we imported, right? So 0 would be 1, 1 would be the other. And then Unreal generates another light map coordinate, but this time now it's a 2. This is how you would be able to target that. And again, if we bumped it down to 0, it means it would use the primary LODs. Not always the best situation, especially when it comes to resolution, but this just is a way that you can auto-specify which UV coordinate you want for your light maps. And then the rest of this stuff, we'll just kind of we'll bypass this because there's a lot of things here more for tweaking, but that covers the general settings. So the next one that I want to cover is collision. So if we expand this out, we can see here we've got spheres, boxes, capitals, convex elements, which again were all generated from here within engine. basically that's just a way for you to see, how many things you have on here. We can select our box, which in this case, some cool things here. If you really want some fine-tune precision control with this, you can actually go in here and tweak these. So if I turn on my simple collision, and I can rotate here, so you can see it moving. This is a way just for you to put in some very hard-coded numbers to be able to adjust that collision. Now again, if I added multiple boxes, you'd see them propagate under here. So instead of 0, we'd have 0, 1, 2, 3, as many as you have. That's a great thing as well if you want some fine-tune control over your precision. Double-sided geometry. This is great for, especially if you got like flat planes or say like windows that you want that collision to occur on both sides. So when you run into it from the front or run into it from the back, it will collide. So that's one there as well. Collision complexity. Now again, this is there's basically 4 options here, but really there's 2 core ones. You've got simple collision and your complex. Now simple as complex, again, will be set in your project defaults if you wanted to switch that so you're targeting your complex collision versus simple. Use simple as complex, so again what we've created here, or if we had imported one, that would say that, hey, use my simple collision, use it as complex. The third option, which is use complex collision as simple, is a way for the editor to take a look at, again, typically your complex collision is going to be your underlying geometry. And if you set that, again, it's got to be set in your project settings to be able to use that complex collision as simple, but it will just target that. Again, you got to be careful with the complex collision as simple because, especially as you have very, very dense meshes, you're talking about a lot of calculations and it can cause a lot of issues. And then project default, which is what all your assets will start out with. Again, that can be set in your project settings. Simple collision physical material, you can assign these as well, which will have more information about it. Again, that's probably another topic about everything you can do with that. Collision preset. So if we expand this out a little bit, we've got block all, overlap AI. Again, I won't go into these because there's a lot of documentation on this one, but this comes in handy, especially as you're building different things that you want the AI to react to certain things, block the player, have some invisible things. So those are just different presets that you can select in there. And then, of course, when you select those, you'll have different subsettings that you can do as well. And then finally, customize collision. That'll usually toggle on or off. That's if you've created something in your DCC program and you go to import it. This is a way for you to check to say, hey, go ahead and use that custom collision. That's what I want. Of course, you uncheck it, it'll use what's ever in the editor. And finally is this last roll up. Again, I told you these things kind of are hidden there. And this walkable slope override. This is very helpful, especially if you're setting, this is as your character's walking, right? And you go up a steep hill and you set that angle. This is a way to override that. So, if you're finding the players hitting like rocks and scaling them up too easily, you can set that in the editor globally, or you can set it on the actual mesh, again, which is just helpful. So again, that's kind of hidden this little roll up here, but another option nonetheless. So cool, that covers collision. So let's go ahead and move on to your import settings. Okay, so let's talk about import settings. So if I expand this out, I'll go ahead and get all these here. There's some cool options here in terms of different things. So this particular flyout corresponds directly with when you go to import an asset for the first time. So, don't be afraid that if you import an asset and you're like, oh shoot, I forgot to, select something to, combine the meshes together. You can still do that post. So you can import it and then select it here. So these should look very similar to the import settings. Static mesh LOD group. This is again one that we can assign in those LODs, which in the case we have large prop. We can do that there. Vertex color override. Degenerates, one that you might find quite often is combining meshes, right? Like if you don't want to collapse everything down in your DCC program, but you want the editor to do it, combining meshes is a great way to do that. So then it shows up, if I minimize this a little bit, then it will show up in the editor as just one single mesh as opposed to a bunch of different ones. So that's there as well. And then, of course, you're importing for your normals, and then you're importing mesh LODs. Again, if you've created your LODs in a DCC program, you'd want to have that checked. transformations, rotation, and uniform scale. This comes in very handy, especially if you've got an asset that, say for example, Maya's working space units is usually centimeters, right? But Unreal's would be meters. And, you've got 100 assets that come in from an artist who's, exported them out of centimeters. And so they're coming in at 100th of the size that they need to. Well, you can override that on your import uniform scale by setting this to, say, 100. And then when you click re-import, it will automatically scale that up to the appropriate size. And of course, the same thing goes for rotation translations. If it's offset and you need it to be zeroed, you can set that as well. Click re-import, it will set that. Convert to scene. This will just reset the FBX coordinate system to the UE4 coordinate systems. Pretty much you leave that on by default. Force front axis. This is a very, very helpful one, especially if you've got a bunch of assets that, are turned 90 degrees in one direction because of somebody's choice of their DCC program. You can force that front axis. So whatever the forward-facing axis is of your DCC program, or whatever you had set in the FBX export settings, you can go ahead and force that to have this particular asset always face front axis. So super helpful at times. And then convert scene unit, which will just convert the scene FBX units to the UE4. Oh, I lied. Scratch that. So UE4 units are centimeters. And then finally, the last thing is your source file path. One thing that may be very, very beneficial in your source file path is, say for example that you have this FBX file somewhere else in your directory, but then you get an updated one, but it resides somewhere else. And you don't want to have to go through the whole process of importing the new one because it's literally the same, but maybe a couple tweaks. You can actually select here, browse for new source file path, and target your new FBX. Now, again, it won't update once you click go ahead and target this. You're going to have to find the new file and then go up to Asset, re-import your asset. And that will go ahead and target the new file, pull it in, and fix it. So super helpful, especially if you made updates, you've moved a file. That's a way that you can retarget it. So that covers our import settings, and let's move on now to navigation and thumbnail. All right, I'm going to include these last two here because navigation, we're not going to cover too much on this one, but this just has to do with your AI and being able to collide with it, go around it, avoid it, so on and so forth, which again is more of a complex process, which we won't cover in this one, so that's navigation. But the last thing is your thumbnail. This is super helpful, especially if you have an asset that is facing a particular direction and it's not a great representation in the editor. You can actually adjust the thumbnail. So if you watch here, I'll make some changes in the thumbnail. But if you watch, in fact, we'll zoom in this a little bit. If you watch this thumbnail, you can see that it actually updates that thumbnail. So again. By defaults, you're probably fine, but this is just great if the particular thumbnail that you have for your asset just doesn't do a good representation. This is one way for you to fix that. Okay, the last thing that I want to cover with your asset, kind of with the static mesh asset window, is this preview scene settings. Now, if you don't see it, you can go up to here, window, preview scene settings. This has everything to do with the physical environment around. Now, they changed this, I want to say, back in 4.18. I could be wrong, but where they added this, it used to kind of just be a gray editor window, but now they've added in the environment cube, your environment, your floor, sky intensity, all that. So this is the actual render scene. So if I toggle off show environment, you'll see we'll go back to gray. If I toggle off show floor, now I've got just the asset. We've got directional light intensity. So it's just basically the preview window. Now this doesn't actually affect the mesh in any way beyond just viewing it. This is independent of the actual editor window. Again, it's just a way that you can see it. It's cool depending on how you look at it. Sometimes it's more annoying, but this preview scene settings, if I'm not mistaken, is actually set per instance. So if I go to the CPU rack 2, never mind, they fixed that. So yeah, so when you change these preview settings, it will go for all of those. Again, it's something if you want to change certain things in there, feel free to. But that is the preview settings scene tab. Again, if you don't have that, just go up to Window, and it's under here, Preview Scene Settings. Click that, and then you'll have control over the actual background. So that concludes kind of running through the static mesh menu and everything that's available to you on your static mesh settings. So again, I hope this helped. If you guys want to see more tips, or if there's certain things that you guys are interested in, definitely leave a comment. I know we've had a couple videos so far based on some feedback. That's great. That helps me out just to know what you guys are looking for, where you're being tripped up in production, and things that I can do to help you guys out to be better, stronger artists, better developers, especially in Unreal Engine. So again, thanks for watching. See you guys next time.